Most people today assume that modern technology made wood better. Faster drying, predictable moisture content, standardized lumber, kilns are treated as an unquestioned improvement. But if you spend time around historic buildings, traditional boats, old barns, or surviving hand tools, you begin to notice something that, really challenges that assumption. Much of the wood that has lasted the longest was never kiln-dried at all. It was seasoned slowly, deliberately, sometimes over decades, using methods shaped by climate, labor patterns, and an intimate understanding of how trees behave after they are cut. What is often overlooked is that the shift to kiln drying didn't just speed up production. It fundamentally changed the character of wood, and in many cases sacrificed durability, resilience, and repairability for short-term efficiency. What follows is not nostalgia for a vanished craft, but a careful look at how pre-industrial societies treated timber as a living material even after the tree was felled, and what those methods can still teach us about longevity, self-reliance, and material intelligence. Before kilns, wood was treated as something that aged rather than something that was processed. In pre-industrial societies, timber seasoning was not an isolated step in manufacturing. It was actually part of a long chain that began with forest management and ended, sometimes years later, in a finished structure or object. Trees were selected with specific uses in mind, cut at particular times of year, and handled in ways that respected how moisture moved through wood fibers. Winter felling was common across Europe, East Asia, and parts of North America because SAP content was lower. Less free water in the wood meant slower, more controlled drying and reduced insect activity. This was not just folklore, it was empirical knowledge built from centuries of observation. A beam cut in winter behaved differently over the next 50 years than one cut in spring, and builders noticed. Seasoning in this context was not about hitting a target moisture percentage, it was about allowing internal stresses to equalize naturally. Wood was expected to move, but to do so gradually and predictably. Air seasoning worked because time, airflow, and restraint were allowed to do their work. The most widespread method of seasoning before industrialization was simple air drying. But, simple really understates just how carefully it was done. Logs were often left intact for months or even years before being sawn, allowing the outer layers to slow the drying of the core. When boards were finally cut, they were stacked with spacers, stickers, placed to promote even airflow while preventing direct sun exposure. Now these stacks were raised off the ground to avoid ground moisture and rot, oriented to prevailing winds and protected by roofs or thatch rather than walls. Rain was actually allowed to wet the surface, but drying was never forced. The goal, you see, was moderation, not speed. In many regions, hardwoods like oak or beech were seasoned for 5 to 10 years before being used in structural applications. Shipped timbers might sit even longer. The result was wood that retained internal flexibility while shedding excess moisture slowly, reducing checking, honeycombing, and long-term warping. Water seasoning sounds, a bit counterintuitive, but it actually solved problems that air drying simply could not. In parts of Scandinavia, the British Isles and Japan, freshly cut logs were submerged in rivers, ponds, or tidal zones for months or even years. This was not about drying at all, but about leaching. Sugars, starches, and resins that attract insects and fungi were gradually washed out. Tannins that caused uneven drying were reduced. In shipbuilding, this made timber more dimensionally stable once it was finally dried. In architecture, it reduced decay in damp environments. After removal from water, the logs were air-dried slowly, often under cover. The combined process took longer than kiln drying by orders of magnitude, but, it produced wood that resisted rot and insect damage without chemical treatments. The method required patience and access to water, but honestly, very little energy input beyond labor. Some woods were seasoned where they would eventually be used. Traditional builders often seasoned timber in situ. Beams were rough-shaped and assembled into frames while still green, then left exposed to the elements for years before walls or roofs were completed. Medieval cathedrals, Japanese temples, and large barns frequently followed this approach. As the wood dried within the structure, joints tightened rather than loosened. Mortise and tenon connections were designed to accommodate shrinkage. This was not accidental. It was a strategy that turned wood movement into an advantage. Modern kiln-dried lumber, by contrast, is often forced below equilibrium moisture content, then installed into environments where it immediately begins to reabsorb moisture. The result is swelling, cracking, and joint failure that pre-industrial builders would have recognized as a predictable outcome of impatience. One of the most important differences between slow seasoning and kiln drying lies at the cellular level. Rapid drying collapses cell walls and locks in internal stress. Wood may, test strong in compression or bending at first, but over time it actually becomes quite brittle. Slowly seasoned wood, it retains a certain degree of plasticity. It tends to absorb shock better, and interestingly it fails gradually rather than, say, catastrophically. This really mattered in pre-industrial societies, where structures had to survive storms, earthquakes, and heavy loads, all without the benefit of modern reinforcements. The survivalist lesson here is not, romantic. It's actually practical. Materials that fail slowly often give us a warning, but those that are overstressed and chemically altered, they tend to fail quite suddenly. The shift to kilns, interestingly, was driven by economics rather than better outcomes. You see, kiln drying spread rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was largely due to industrial-scale urbanization and the pressing need to standardize building materials. In this new world, time became money. Lumber yards simply couldn't afford to sit on inventory for 10 years. Kilns. They allowed wood to be dried in mere weeks. They also enabled species and cuts to be mixed and matched without regard for traditional limitations. For mass housing and disposable construction, this was perfectly acceptable. However, for longevity, it certainly was not. The problem isn't really that kilns exist, but that their limitations are rarely acknowledged. Kiln drying, you see, solves a logistical problem, but it also creates a material problem that must then be managed with glues, fasteners, finishes, and, chemical treatments. Old timber seasoning methods, honestly, reveal a mindset that's increasingly rare these days. Builders planned for decades, sometimes even generations. Forests were managed with future needs in mind, and materials were allowed to become ready rather than being sort of forced into readiness. For those interested in resilience and self-reliance, this really has direct implications. Wood that's harvested locally, seasoned patiently, and used with respect for its properties is, easier to repair, less dependent on industrial inputs, and more forgiving under stress. Understanding these methods also clarifies why so many historic wooden structures have outlasted modern ones. It wasn't, superior tools or secret techniques. It was time, restraint, and an unwillingness to rush a material that simply does not respond well to force. When old seasoning methods are dismissed as obsolete, what is really being dismissed is a form of knowledge rooted in long observation and accountability across generations. These methods were not perfect, but, they were honest about trade-offs. Kilns did not ruin good wood by accident. They did so by prioritizing speed and uniformity over longevity and adaptability. Understanding that trade-off allows modern builders, woodworkers, and survival-minded individuals to make informed choices rather than just defaulting to industrial norms. Remembering how timber was once seasoned matters because it reminds us that some problems are not solved by acceleration, and that durability often comes from allowing systems, whether materials or societies, to mature at their own pace. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis and practical insight, consider subscribing to Old World Timber Tricks. And if this episode added something to how you think about materials, time, and resilience, share it with others who care about understanding the past on its own terms.